In times of brokenness and heartbreak, we need to remember to lean into our faith, that these challenges bring out the true metal of our relationship to God. I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, so what many of you may not know about me is that this is the second time I've lived through race riots and my city burning. I grieve with you as our city writhes between chaos and a search for justice and closure. I ask you today to not make the mistakes I have seen. Do not let 6 months go by and let your heart remain untouched. Let this set your heart on fire. Pray that God empowers us to change the culture and the system that allows for this kind of injustice to happen. Let this change you so you seek out hard conversations, not just with people you know, but with communities of color, with police, and with government. We have an obligation as Christians to be the peacemakers. So let us pray together that God grants our city and our country the spiritual gifts necessary to enact His loving vision for our world. I volunteered to share my faith story with you today because I thought it might be helpful for all of us to remember how God lifts us up when we surrender all to Him, which is especially important right now with the pandemic and race riots that we're facing. My story starts in an Episcopal church in Cincinnati, Ohio. I grew up really trying to get to know God and struggling to connect to the God I felt versus the God my church and family kept telling me about. To me, the God I was taught about felt distant. And so I decided to get very involved in the church so I could feel God. I became an acolyte, a lay reader, a chalice bearer. I even worked on the intercessory prayer rotation because I was so desperate to make that connection with God, someone my parents had very much impressed upon me how important He is. And yet, I came to realize in this flurry of activity that I felt empty. Walking into a church made me feel hollow. All these actions became an exhausting way for me to feel pride without feeling faith. After the conference, which affirmed the first gay bishop within the Episcopal Church, the unloving and unchristian behavior I witnessed in that struggle in 2005 was enough to make me take a step back from embracing Christianity. I still felt there was a higher power out there, but I no longer was convinced I knew His name. Now, my story is riddled with what I call crucible moments. Moments that test you and break you and force you to realize just how much is completely out of your control. My decision to walk away from the church led to my first crucible moment while I was studying abroad in China. Everything about my academic program was falling apart, and my program director had it out for me. She was determined to make my life miserable, and it was working, along with a growing fear that my credits from this program wouldn't transfer, which would severely impact my ability to continue my major and for my future academic plans. I tried for months to figure it out on my own until I hit a breaking point. And I remember this moment in crystal clarity because God took His divinely massive hand and shoved me to the ground on my knees. And through the cloud of worry and stress and tears, God just laughed at me and said, "You were never meant to handle this alone. This is when you surrender to me." And I realized I had no control over what could happen. I thought I could shape the future, and I was utterly, undeniably wrong. I took a breath and released all of it and felt light and joyful for the rest of my program, which, by the way, ended up syncing perfectly back into my academic plans when I got home. I bought a Chinese English Bible, started going to church again while abroad, and I knew my God was a Christian God who restored me in his hands. So I learned the lesson, right? That surrendering all to God is good and that everything works out the way it needs to when you trust him, right? Wrong. Upon my return, I got a kung fu injury that gave me nerve pain, and I hurt. To say it hurt is an understatement. I've dealt with chronic kidney stones and childbirth, which helpful doctors love to say would be the most pain I would ever feel in my life. They were wrong. This pain was an electrifying agony that lasted for hours at a time, with no known trigger and no known end, and lasted not days but months of my life. I tried every medication and treatment available to me from Western and Eastern medicine, and I still was left to scream and sob with these unrelenting waves of pain that I was shocked to discover my body could bear. After months of doctors and treatments that failed, I finally met a holistic doctor who was very honest with me and said, Rachel, we see this in patients sometimes where their bodies just reject treatment. And I found that this kind of pain calls for spiritual healing and not medical intervention. I was devastated, but it felt right to me because my body had systematically rejected every medicine and treatment. And not only did they not work, but they also made me worse. I was terrified. I was confused. How could God do this to me? But I literally had no choice left. I could pray and meditate and hash things out with God, or I could continue in the most debilitating pain of my life. So, yes, people, you guessed right. I chose prayer. I prayed every day for hours at a time. The pain would come, and I learned not to scream, not to cry, but to breathe, confident in the knowledge that God was with me in this crucible time. And after following this routine for weeks, I remember the day that it all changed. I felt the pain rise up like a big black dragon that I had to methodically stare down, and I felt truly unafraid for the first time. I knew God was with me and that his heavenly hosts were at my back and that this pain could touch my body, but it couldn't touch me. It couldn't break me. It couldn't change me. That what was most essential of me belonged to God. And after all that time wallowing in fear and despair, I finally left because I knew exactly what the pain could do. But all of a sudden, I could see what the pain couldn't touch. And I could honestly say out loud, I am not afraid. Because I knew down to the core of who I am, God was with me, and I surrendered all to him. And the pain I grew so familiar with vanished. I never experienced it again. This was one of the first miracles God granted me. God and I had conquered the dragon, and my faith remained altered forever because of it. So I learned my lesson, right? Unfortunately, wrong. But before things went terribly wrong, some things went perfectly right. I was in a relationship with the love of my life, the wonderful and lovely Chris Sankler, and I was accepted into the Asian Studies Master's program at UC Santa Barbara. I even received a scholarship to further my language learning back in China. Things were going wonderfully. And every time I had a deadline or a test that I thought I couldn't handle, I would pray, God, if you want me here, help me get through this. And He did, over and over again. I had a magnificent GPA and I got accepted into the PhD program. God also helped me get through the challenges as well, like a migraine that lasted 4 months while I was in grad school, losing my brother-in-law 6 months before I got married, and eventually what I thought of as the mystery disease that made me begin to lose the ability to walk in the final months before I finished my degree, my master's degree. And then my world shifted. God told me to leave. Now, I liked having a 5-year plan, knowing I would get a degree and have my life's work cut out for me. I worked hard and I wanted that respect and that ability to share knowledge about a culture that meant so much to me. But here's the thing, when God calls, you need to listen. What I thought I had wanted changed. And when God said to leave with, I remind you, no plan, I was terrified because every other time God has called me, there was always a plan of what to do next. And here I was, crippled, and had no idea what to do next except to say, okay, God, I trust you. And then, folks, this is where my life got really hard. I went from being able to walk for a few minutes outside to being unable to crawl from my couch to the kitchen table. I want to take you through this because I have no greater experience of complete surrender. I would stand and begin to get the sensation of drowning in air. My mind would fog over and my limbs would go weak, and I would collapse on the ground, unable to get enough air to call out for help, unable to move anything other than a few fingers and toes. I was mostly paralyzed on the floor, and it would frequently be hours before I had the strength to stand. I never knew when it would start, only that it would happen multiple times a day while my newly wedded husband was away working 2 different pastor jobs. I had never felt so helpless in my whole life. I began to leave Bibles in different spots on the floor so I could read when I fell, and would obsessively research just how did Jesus pray? I became convinced that I simply wasn't doing it right. Surely God would just lift this from me if I just prayed hard enough with the right words. So I thought, maybe my language is just too flowery. Maybe I just need to get to the point. What I came to love in the instances of Jesus praying was the simplicity of his language. He would just say, walk, rise, be healed. And they would be every single time like magical clockwork. So I prayed, walk, 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 over and over again. And nothing. I prayed for God to rip away my unbelief so no part of me would be a stumbling block to Him. And nothing. And then, after months of being mostly bedridden, I suddenly felt God tell me to get up and walk. I was in shock, but the call was so strong, I didn't even take the time to change out of my pajamas. I just grabbed my gym shoes and Christian music and went out the door. Now, most of you would probably assume that I would be ecstatic, that after months of not moving, I suddenly had the ability to stand. But I was scared. God, I could really feel God in that moment. But Chris was gone at work, and I was alone, completely alone. So if God deserted me in the middle of this walk, I would be left collapsed on the pavement with no way to get back home. I was shaking that God was asking this kind of trust from me. As I left my apartment building, I started to just completely rail at God and have the kind of honest heart to heart that our relationship really needed. Every time I hit an intersection, I would ask God to tell me where to go. And every time I would feel a pull in a certain direction. And off we went, traipsing around parts of the city I had never even been to before. I started telling God, okay, if you ask this of me, I will walk with you. And if I fall, I will fall with you. And every breath, I will breathe with you. Until finally, I asked God, just, what do you want from me? And coming from my headphones, I could hear Stephen Curtis Chapman sing, and I swear I could feel God smile as I heard, whatever, whatever you say, whatever, I will obey. A few hours later, God finally led me to a park bench and said, Rachel, it's not your legs that are broken, it's your heart. And at that time, I felt completely brokenhearted over what my life looked like and felt like. So to me, these words lifted me up. It made me feel like I could be made whole. However, here's the incredibly beautiful thing. A few months later, I received a diagnosis that confirmed I actually had a problem with my heart called postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. And so God had given me a layered message of healing for my spirit and for my body. When I woke up the next day, I again lost the ability to walk. But I was amazed to find that I felt no pain despite walking for 4 hours the day before, which was the most physical activity I had been able to accomplish in months. So I'd like you to follow along with me as I came to discern what all this meant. Did God make these challenges happen to me? I still cannot answer that fundamental question, but here is what I know. God changed the trajectory of my life for the better. With my first encounter with nerve pain, I came to trust in God like my life depended on it, and that radically changed my faith. When my physical health and God's call forced me to leave my plan for a PhD, I was able to reclaim a life filled with joy. I've come to realize I never would have been happy in that lifestyle because it always demanded more than I could give and never left me any time to reflect on what I truly wanted from life. I realized if I'd gone down that path, it would have taken years for me to see how miserable I would be. And God saved me from that. Lastly, with the health issues I've had with my heart, I came to see that God used this experience to draw me in close and to give me what I needed, not what I wanted. I wanted to be fully healed, to be fully able to live a physically independent life. But what I needed was to be secure in the knowledge that wherever I was in my life, God was with me in every breath, in every step, and in every fall. After receiving the miracle of walking for a day, I came to know a peace with the Lord that I had never known before. After that, every time I fell, which is frequent and often, I can surrender to God with all that I am. I've come to believe that this is God's way of calling me to prayer, that He's literally drawing me to my knees to be with Him. And that was exactly where I'm meant to be, despite my feelings of helplessness. I learned that prayer was not just about asking for help or for offering praise, but to make space to listen to God. This was one of the hardest lessons of my life. That in the moments of my greatest vulnerability and weakness, I had to relinquish any notion that I had control over my life and my body. The only control we have is the choice to accept that God is in control. And when you know that, you may come to truly know peace. So, does this mean that I have discovered a transcendent peace that has followed me all the rest of my days? Did I learn my lesson? Sadly, no. I still actively struggle with pain and falling. I still feel helpless. I still feel angry. I still feel panic when I lose the strength to stand or even think. But I remember God is there. I still hold on to the miracles He has bestowed on me. I still remember He has taken these crucible moments to reforge me into a Christian whose faith cannot be broken, only tested. God has used these struggles to purify the metal of my faith, and that has only made me stronger. In times of brokenness, I have learned to reach first and foremost for God's grace, love, and peace. So, what does that mean for us in the Twin Cities as we face this pandemic and racial crisis? I believe this is a crucible moment, a time for us to be broken, a time for us to feel our anger, a time for us to transform, a time for us to have a life-changing heart-to-heart with God, a time to surrender our helplessness to God and listen to His call for a radical form of love that Jesus exemplified. To let our first and last tool be to reach for God's love and give ourselves over to Him to be made into instruments of change. Recognize when God is knocking you down to your knees. Surrender to Him and become a vessel for the peace and love we can only know through Christ. Thank you for taking the time to listen to me today. God bless.